I'm Robert Zitz. I'm Senior Vice President and Chief Systems Architect at Leidos, former Intel senior, 30-plus years, worked space architectures, and so on. Really glad to have you this morning. The panel, I almost feel like we had somehow gotten a hold of DepSecDef Works presentation and written in a few lines before he spoke this morning, because anybody who was there would have seen and heard him talk about the importance and the need for space resilience. He then talked about the need for lower cost satellites to be able to get onto orbit relatively quickly, and he talked about the need for the ground architecture to include an ability to have a user interface to use the data. And I think we'll touch on many of those this afternoon as well. The format today will be we're going to have students, as in some of the other breakout groups and working groups, where students will come around with 3x5 cards, gathering up questions, ask the expert type question cards. They'll pass them up to me as the moderator, and then I'll ask the questions. Our format will be each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to make their key points. Then we'll open it up. So that'll give us about 45 minutes for them to relay their thoughts to you, and about 40 to 45 minutes for your Q&A. We want it to be somewhat informal, and there could be crosstalk between the panelists. This is a great opportunity to hear from some real experts. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. Major General Roger Teague is the Director of Space Programs, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Acquisition. He directs development and purchasing on space and missile programs to the Air Force's major commands, product centers, and laboratories, and dealing with acquisition programs. Next to the general, to his left, is Tom Weber. Tom is the Director of Space and Strategic Systems Directorate Technical Center down at the Army SMDC in Huntsville, Alabama. He is responsible for managing research and technology development in the areas of space superiority, small satellites, high altitude, tactically responsive space, and also cyberspace technologies. To Tom's left is Mark Choiniere. Mark is the Acting Director of Research and Development at NGA. He previously has served as the Director of Advanced Development. He was at the National Reconnaissance Office in Advanced Systems and Technology. He's also worked in virtually all of the key components of NGA, including analysis, acquisition, has worked on some of their sensitive special programs. Next to Mark is Dr. Gordon Roesler, who is the Program Manager in DARPA's Tactical Technology Office. He's developing the capability to provide robotic servicing to geostationary geosync satellites. This is his second time at DARPA. He was there in 2002 to 2006 as well. So with no further ado, General, I'd like to hand it over to you for your thoughts.
Great. Well, Rob, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's industry partners, friends, colleagues. It's great to be able to join you all this afternoon, and certainly my panel of distinguished experts as well, to talk about certainly what Deputy Secretary of Defense Work mentioned this morning, and that's the importance of resiliency in space, our space systems, and our architectures. And so I'm pleased to be able to share a few thoughts. Really, as you look across it, it's not lost on this audience the importance of space, U.S. space and space capabilities. They are a critical force multiplier to all that we do, and certainly for our warfighting capability. Certainly from peacetime operations, it's a key element of our U.S. deterrent strategy. Certainly contributes to stability during crisis and presents options for our national command authorities, as well as during wartime, being able to enhance the combat effectiveness and reduce casualties and loss. Certainly, space systems and space capabilities underpins and is foundational to every joint operation anywhere in the globe. And so it's with that background and that setting that I would offer just a few thoughts, and that today's U.S. military and global economic dependence on space make it an attractive target for our adversaries. And we've seen our space environment evolve, if you will, from one of a relative sanctuary certainly over the last several decades up to now, of one where it may be an adversary may choose to engage our space systems. We've certainly seen the explosive growth in terms of the number of nations that are spacefaring today. 11 different countries can now launch objects into space. And concerningly, we are seeing testing of anti-satellite technologies. And as all of us who use and appreciate this great domain, it is of great concern. And so it's likely that future adversaries may choose to try to deny or disrupt or degrade U.S. space capabilities. And so that's why I think resiliency is such an important topic today. It's something that we should all get our minds around and actively plan towards as we look towards our futures. And it's important that we understand this relevancy and really take time to ask the question, so what? What does it mean for the way we think, the way we act, and the way we plan our future missions? I thought it'd be important first to talk about what are we talking about when we say resiliency. Definitionally, Air Force Space Command defines resiliency as the ability of a system architecture to continue providing required capabilities in the face of system failures, environmental challenges, or adversary actions. Make no mistake, the United States is not looking for a fight in space, but we must be prepared to defend ourselves in the event of hostile actions. Now, many of you are familiar, I don't know whether or not Secretary Work mentioned this morning, but in 2014, OSD conducted a strategic portfolio review, and space was prominently featured. And there were three key findings, I think, that are shaping our future as we go forward. First, it's important that we have the ability to identify a threat. This is very much a mind shift change to domain awareness, just like we have in every other operational domain, whether it be air, land, sea, or cyberspace. Second, it's important that we have the ability to assure our space capabilities against aggressive and comprehensive counter-space programs through resilient capabilities, agile defense, and reconstitution. And finally, we need to have the ability to deny space capabilities to potential adversaries who target U.S. force structure. Now, first and foundationally in any operation in going forward, it's important that we be able to see and understand our operational environment. That's why we've placed such a big emphasis on space situational awareness. It underpins everything that we're trying to, every mission and every activity that we try to do. And so over the years, we have evolved, if you will, from a traditional space situational architecture, as I mentioned before, one that sought to simply track and catalog space objects, to one much more strong ability to be able to discern and characterize exactly what's going on to achieve that domain awareness that we're looking for. In the end, we are developing the ability to persistently and rapidly detect, characterize, and attribute all on-orbit activity. And our intent is to field the best mix of near and deep space sensors. These include new technologies for enhanced survivability and giving our commanders options to respond to threats. And they include integrated real-time intelligence through enhanced space situational awareness systems. And finally, these initiatives underscore the importance of our need to affirm our partnerships and share data both internally to our departments and agencies within the United States government, as well as with our international partners. Beyond our space situational awareness capabilities, we're examining end-to-end architectures across all of our core mission areas to include information assurance architectures and make them also more resilient. As you all well know, there's much more to space than just the assets that are on orbit, and it includes the synchronization of our ground-based systems and also our user equipment. And so in the end, you have to look at this architecture as a whole, and you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so we are doing, as I said before, an end-to-end analysis to make sure that we understand exactly where our strengths and our vulnerabilities are, and taking actions to make sure that we secure those vulnerabilities. Our architectures must be able to operate through any threat to deter adversaries and preserve capability. And so as an example that many of you are familiar with, we are taking a special look at our strategic communications and looking whether or not it makes sense to alter the architectures there with regard to our protected and tactical and our protected strategic communications architectures, as well as with our missile warning architectures, the OPIR systems, and trying to understand, is there a need to necessarily differentiate between our strategic and our tactical layers there? And the use of staring and scanning sensors that we have and featured within our OPIR systems. In the end, again, it's a comprehensive solution, and we're working through a series of analysis of alternatives for each of these efforts to make sure that we're coming to the right solution across the board, making sure that we balance, again, affordability, capability, and most importantly, resiliency. Finally, I'd be remiss, certainly with all the discussion that we've had recently, to underpin the importance of our launch infrastructure. It's important that we have resilient launch capabilities. Assured access to space is one of our highest priorities, and we've got to be able to have an assured, reliable, and resistant launch capability. Our launch systems give us the global capabilities that we all know that we need and depend upon, whether it's global navigation and timing, missile warning, communications, weather, and intelligence capability on orbit. And so we are introducing competition into our EELV program, while at the same time working to reduce our reliance on the Russian RD-180 engine. And we're trying to leverage the growing commercial launch market to drive down costs. This is no easy task, and with our cooperation of Congress and certainly working through the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the White House, we're working very aggressively to make sure, with advisement of our industry launch partners, that we get it right here. But it's going to take time, and it's important that we take the time to make sure that we get it right. There's a lot at stake. So in the end, our goal will be that we have at least 2 certified commercially viable providers for national security space launches. So it certainly is an exciting time to be in space, and I look forward to your questions and further discussion. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, good afternoon, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here as well, especially representing the Army Space and Missile Defense Command. Before I talk specifically about resilience and what that kind of means to the Army from a tactical perspective, I wanted to give you a little bit about Space and Missile Defense Command, Army Forces Strategic Command, because we are the Army's proponent for space missile defense and ground-based, space high altitude and ground-based missile defense. We're also the Army Service Component Command to US STRATCOM. So when it's space related, we are usually the ones that they're coming to within the Army to work that through. So we have 3 primary lines of effort, the first being our operations, and that's the things that our warfighters are doing today. They manage the global wideband satellite communications, payload information. We provide Army space support teams to the combatant commands, commercial imaging teams, and many people in this room are probably very familiar with the products and how that works. We also do joint friendly force tracking, as well as provide JTAGs, missile warning information to combatant commanders. So that's operations going on 24/7, 365 within the command. We are also within a capability development line of effort. We are responsible for training and equipping the future space forces, as well as developing the Army space training strategy. So very much space focused there. And on the technology side, we research, test, and integrate, whether it's space, directed energy, cyberspace, and related technologies to deliver capability to the warfighter down the road. So a very diverse command and very unique in that we have operations, capability development, as well as technology. So why is space resilience critical to the Army? Well, a lot of people don't realize that the Army is the largest user of space and space-enabled capabilities. The Army relies on space to communicate, navigate, and deliver precision fires. It's how they win wars, right? How they meet the national intent. So within the Army's operating concept, one of the 20 warfighting challenges is to conduct space and cyber electromagnetic operations and maintain communications. So the only way we're going to maintain overmatch, the Army's got to ensure that we have uninterrupted access to critical communications and information links via SATCOM, to position, navigation, and timing, and to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. All of this in a very multi-domain architecture when operating in a contested, congested, and competitive operating environment. We heard from Secretary Work earlier, and it's been a theme throughout the day. We are not free to do whatever we want in space without potential adversarial action. So as potential enemies develop counter-space capabilities like anti-satellite weapons to disrupt the U.S.'s ability to communicate and give the Army freedom to maneuver, the Army's got to develop capabilities while anticipating the enemy's efforts to disrupt those capabilities. And we're going to have to maintain overmatch because the Joint Force is relying on combining technologies, integrating those efforts across multiple domains in order to give us capability during multiple dilemmas and adversarial action. So resiliency, to me, certainly requires a layered approach. We're not looking at one layer. We've got to give critical mission-related information to the warfighter. We've got to make it available when they need it and how they need it. So I think a combination of certainly of terrestrial, airborne, and space, and I think within the space resiliency, we're looking at both government and commercial capabilities that we can leverage off of and take advantage of. So how do we deliver those resilient space capabilities? So within the Army Space and Missile Defense Command, we are exploring technologies that are deployed on nano and small satellites to deliver the needed capabilities to the tactical warfighter. Again, our focus is going to be on the tactical warfighter, that guy and gal at the pointy end of the spear that all too often need information but are generally the last ones to get it because of our process of how you task, how you get a priority, and how you actually get that information. So the technology trends in both electronics and computer over the last 20 years has enabled the development of satellites that are small, they're low cost, but still have very significant military utility. And so small satellites deployed in large numbers in low Earth orbit offer resiliency and some key advantage for future military operations. So some of those, certainly a proliferated constellation that slowly degrades even under an active attack, that's resiliency. It's not cutting off our capability with any one loss. Individual satellites are very difficult for an adversary to detect and track. Just the inverse square law gives us a tremendous RF transmit and receive advantage in low Earth orbit. The exchange ratio for an anti-satellite weapon is probably in a small satellite's favor. If you've got one large satellite to take out, one ASAT is a relatively cheap return on investment. If you've got dozens or hundreds of satellites providing a capability, taking out 1, 2, or even 10 does not help the situation. So that starts to swing the pendulum back in our favor. Designing small satellites for a much shorter lifespan allows a much more frequent design and technology refresh. You look at applying Moore's law every 18 months, our computer power doubles. You look at the significance that technology will enable us to give capability-wise just over the next 5, 10, and 20 years. And so as the Army's looking at this, we're focusing on that 2025 and beyond. What does the Army need to do to be prepared to fight that next fight? Fight in those obscure and very austere environments where there is not infrastructure. And so we're looking at how technology will help us do that. The other aspect of resiliency and small sats they're very tailorable to very specific mission or AOR surge requirements. The Army doesn't know where it's going to fight next, but it's got to be prepared to fight there, wherever it is and whatever those conditions are. Small satellites help to give us some architecture and some ISR and some other critical capability coverages and on very short notice. And I'll mention that a little bit, getting back to General Teague and the launch piece of that. System of system capabilities are disrupted, disaggregated, and proliferated with constellations, so that inherently makes them more survivable. So as we look back at a responsive and persistent capability, you look at satellites in low Earth orbit that are multiple planes and large constellations. Now we're covering areas that we don't currently have coverage. We have persistent, all the time coverage. Gives us information that we do not currently have, and it prevents an adversary from being able to do things when we're not in view, because we're always there. So the persistence is a key thing. And from a warfighter perspective, the large number of satellites help the end user, because now they've got a better, higher priority. They're able to task those directly, and that gives the information to the lowest levels of the command. But it's certainly very important to understand that satellites do not replace the existing systems. The intent of resiliency is to augment, fill the gaps, provide survivable underlays to the strategic systems. That's the resiliency. And another key point to make in resiliency is we must be able to protect the ground architecture as well. Because no matter how good or elaborate our space-based systems are, if we can't get the critical needed information to the end user in a timely manner, it's not doing us any good. And so getting back to the space piece, in order for small satellites to truly provide the maximum resiliency, we have got to have the ability to provide dedicated, low-cost, responsive launch. If you're going to launch a $200,000 satellite, you don't want to launch, and no offense to EELV, but you don't want to launch on a $60 million rocket. We can't do that. So we've got to get after the launch problem. It's difficult, but absolutely critical to allowing resiliency. And a final note, I just want to highlight the importance of collaboration across the services, DoD, industry, and other government agencies. We must break down barriers. We've got to work together, maximize the investment in these very reduced budget environments to take full advantage of the technology and the sharing and leveraging so that we can get maximum return on investment for the taxpayer. And so with that, I'm looking forward to the questions and answers, and appreciate again the time being here.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, good afternoon, and thanks to the USGF for the forum. I think they have really hit the mark the last 10 years or 11 years on the topics they pick. And these forums are a great way to get some issues highlighted that need to be broached. And thanks to Rob. Rob's been ahead of the curve on most of these issues over the last 20 years or so. He was the first one talking about full motion video and persistent surveillance and a lot of these topics that we tee up that are enduring issues that need to be solved for the department. So I'm acting director of InnoVision right now. We've got a new director coming in a couple of weeks, Peter Heineman. Hopefully you'll get a chance to meet him. He's here. My focus the last couple of years, particularly when I was an NGA person over at AS&T, was to really look at the resilience piece and kind of see what the proposition was there. As Director Cardillo said this morning, we're a customer from that standpoint. So NGA per se, and on behalf of the NSG, we're not advocating for tougher satellites or bigger satellites, but we are advocating for, as was already covered very well, making sure we think about the string that gets those data sets to the ground. So when it's not just about a satellite, it's not just comms, it's not just about the ground processing, and it's not about the cross-links, for instance, that move those data sets around. At the end of the day, you have a customer, and that customer has a decision window that needs to be met by those satellites. That's why we build them, that's why we fly them. And no customer wants to be the one sitting there saying, you know, the satellite survived, but didn't get the data that we need to take the actions that we're trying to support. So I'm increasingly in this role talking about GEOINT assurance. And GEOINT assurance, to me, is a focus on that customer in the center of the dialogue, and knowing what that customer is trying to do. And making sure that the resiliency we're talking about is, again, as has been discussed, in depth to the point where we get the data that we need, and those data inform that decision maker. Typically, when you're teeing up a course of action, there's a window to maintain that decision maker's best course of action. And we've got to get those data sets in time to support that decision. Director Cardinal talks about that as consequence. Making that customer, you know, centric in that discussion starts the dialogue by what options do we have, and that's where the darkening in the skies and the swarm concepts come about for commercial. I started a study effort a couple of years ago to look at this, and it was pretty clear to me that the way we were going from 13 on, we are going to reach a tipping point at some point with the commercial capability. I think that's closer to 19 than it is to 17, but I'm no expert on that. I'm not going to pretend to be. But the notion that we would have a commercial satellite or a commercial capability or the Internet of Things available to answer a decision maker's query, I think it's problematic in the near term. And I differ from my colleagues in some way with that viewpoint. And the reason I say that is, in order to meet that decision maker's timeline, you need to be looking pretty much day-night, all-weather, multispectral, persistent, 24/7, 365, you know, in the face of denial and deception we're well warned against, and also in the face of natural and man-made interference. So again, stepping back from this tactical discussion, we don't have sensors that can do that today. And the reason is we're kind of thin, frankly, on the national side. And on the commercial side, it's a fledgling market that's building out, but we're not looking all the time, and we're not looking in some cases in the right spectra or with the proper phenomenology to answer some of these questions we have, the enduring questions. So again, from a GEOINT assurance construct, you know, it would be ideal for the director of NGA, for instance, on behalf of the NSG, to be able to assure that decision maker that we have an expectation that we're going to get the information. And again, I'm looking at it from a GEOINT view, so we're not, you know, sending humaners out or something. But to me, that's the definition of GEOINT assurance. My small sat study effort that I've been doing for a couple of years now, it's called the Alternative Space-Based Persistent Phenomenology Project Capability. And I was told the other day, that's a crappy acronym. And it is, but if you're an NGA guy sitting inside AS&T and you're putting together a small sat project in a palace that's not that happy about small sats, you would probably call it something similar. But that project, interestingly enough, it kind of proved to me that, you know, we need a different approach. We need to be more agile. You spoke about Kestrel Eye, and the lament for Kestrel Eye is that's been ready to go to space for how long now? You know, probably 5 years. It's got a banging telescope on it. If it goes up, pretty soon. I mean, that would make everybody happy. But the NanoEye similarly is a satellite with a great telescope that can't get to space for lack of a ride. It makes no sense whatsoever on the government side, and it's not going to make sense on the commercial side to spend a couple of $100,000. I think you mentioned 200,000, but if you spend 400,000 doing the integration and putting a good telescope or a spectrometer on a vehicle, who is going to turn around and spend 60 or 70 million to get that to space? So I have a 10-sat concept that I've been talking about doing. I think we could do it for under 200 million. It's my idea. It's not an NGA idea. I think under this 10-sat concept, you would do a 2-year program. You would make a run to put 10 vehicles into space. You would do maybe the first 4 or 5 as government-sponsored vehicles. You would go after the phenomenology that the NSG has identified as a priority. I would say that's hyperspectral, LiDAR, radar, some type of banging CubeSat capability. I have one that has about 120 little chips that pop out. They're radar. They're kind of crazy looking. If you looked at them in space, you'd kind of think, what the hell is that? And so it messes with the adversary a little bit. There's that factor. And then from maybe the 4th or 5th one on through number 10, you look to industry and academia maybe to come up with those payloads, and those are more commercial vehicles. But in the meantime, the US government goes after some quick launch, as we talked about. You drive those launch costs down. Instead of doing one every 2 months, once you're ready to go, try and do 3 in a month or 4 in a month just to prove we can do it. It'd be ideal to do that when we didn't have a requirement to do it. I think it would be really bad to have to do that because you have a requirement to do that and we haven't thought about it, or we have no program to do that. Like if something happened next month, what would you do about that? And that's a bad time to think about it, I would submit. So anyway, I think we've called that a 10-sat idea. I don't claim ownership for it, but I think it's a banging idea. And for the small sat, I think we're trying to bridge, until we hit the tipping point with commercial, that you have a demand in the commercial market for the types of products and services that we're talking about. I don't think we're going to get there in the next couple of years. I think that's a really vulnerable period from my standpoint. And again, my standpoint, to get back to what I started with, because I probably confused people with talking about a launch program, is focusing on that decision maker who has to make that decision, whether the satellite's safe or not. Now, so we should plan that the constellation is safe, that the crosslinks, the comms, the ground processing is safe. We had anthrax issues years ago. But once you do that, you still have a customer at the end of the day who has a decision to make and needs those data sets, hopefully, to help them make that decision. So thanks again for including me with the panel. I have some details on my small sat project I can share.
Thanks, Mark.
I'm looking forward to the questions.
Sure, there'll be a lot of questions about the 10-sat as we do the Q&A. Gordon?
Rob, I want to thank you for inviting me here, and I'm really honored to be with these distinguished panelists. I am from DARPA. I was looking around the showroom floor today and trying to assess, so how many of these had any connection with DARPA at one time or another? I did notice one ground station design out there that began as a DARPA seedling, but I think maybe in this community people aren't as familiar with DARPA. Particularly, you may not be familiar with what we're doing for the resiliency issue. DARPA's efforts in space, just in my office, include launch, they include battle management and C², and they include new ways of doing things once we get on orbit. On the launch side, we're looking at a couple of unconventional ideas. One of them is under the F-15. It's called ALASA. Small payloads, but choice of orbits, choice of takeoff and landing spots, unmodified F-15. So it's a really exciting way of getting things into space quickly and in a very agile way. The other program is called XS-1, Experimental Spaceplane 1, which is a reusable spacecraft, 3,000 to 5,000 pounds. It's really actually a first stage, and then you put a second stage on top of it. But 3,000 to 5,000 pounds to LEO, multiple flights per week. You know, it has all the challenges inherent in it that reusable spacecraft do, but these are the kind of things that DARPA tries to take on. So we're looking at access to space and trying to do things orthogonal to what the rest of the community is doing. In battle management and C², we have the Orbit Outlook program, which is trying to integrate a bunch of non-conventional sensors in order to improve the amount of data that's coming in for SSA, or now SDA. And then we have the Hallmark program just getting started, which is a battle management, command and control tool of the future, you know, beyond JMS and beyond what we do now. We want to be able to have real-time decision-making to increase the resilience of our space systems. And then doing different things once we get on orbit. I don't know any other field of human endeavor, and certainly no other field of military activity, where we put $1 billion into an asset, put it someplace, and never look at it or touch it again. I mean, that is you know, absolutely unique to the space environment. And so my particular program is to try to do something about that. We've been hearing about space servicing for decades, really. I gave a speech recently, and I found a picture of a Lockheed concept from 1958 that was a robotic space servicer. So my idea is not new, but let me describe some of the things we can do about resiliency. I am building a robotic servicing vehicle. It's got arms on it, and they don't look anything like human arms, but it's going to go out into geostationary orbit, and it's going to repair other satellites. Now, I recognize that most GEOINT itself comes from low Earth orbiting satellites. There's nothing about the technology that isn't applicable in LEO. We're going to GEO because of the number of customers that are up there. And of course, as Ron talked about, the communications that we all rely on reside primarily in GEO. And we're going to provide 3 basic services to the satellites that are out there. We're going to do inspection. Now, we know there are other satellites that are out there doing inspection. The Air Force's announcement of GSAP recently I think, has tremendous deterrent value, and the announcement actually said that. As General Hyten said on 60 Minutes the other day, there aren't going to be any more surprises in GEO. The difference between that inspection and the inspection we'll provide is we'll be able to inspect within inches. So we have cameras on the end of our robot arms, so we'll be able to look over, under, around, and through and get close to mechanisms that aren't functioning properly or suspicious objects on the outside of our satellites and really take a look at them. Then we'll be able to do the old space tug mission of dock and push. This has a resiliency feature in that if a satellite has to evade an attack, we can go and dock with it and push it back to its original orbit, saving 50 to 75% of its propellant. So we won't allow people to run us out of gas by just shooting at us and making us move around. And then there's a repair capability that these highly dexterous robot arms with multiple tools, Swiss Army knife in space is what I call it, will be able to help with, for example, some of the beginning of life anomalies like solar panels that don't deploy, antennas that don't deploy. We'll be able to do manipulations in order to help push those out. Now, so what we're providing here is resilience through deterrence, first of all, with that inspection capability. Resilience through conservation of fuel and fleet management, resilience through repair. But now let me tell you about another capability that we've realized recently that we have that I'm extremely excited about. All of the technology to do those 3 missions is enabling us to install new payloads on GEO spacecraft that are already on orbit. We do all these things completely cooperatively. We have complete coordinated operation between the client spacecraft ops center and our ops center. But we'll be able to hang mechanically a box on an orbiting spacecraft. Now, you can use your own imagination what you might want to have in that box. General Whalen first suggested that one of our first ones should be a space weather sensor. so we can find out whether satellite anomalies were caused, and we're getting the data locally now. It's not a remote thing, but it's a local determination of space weather. But you can imagine self-inspection, you can imagine defensive payloads. So we're very excited about this from the resilience point of view. We're also excited about it from the innovation point of view. So CubeSats have been mentioned here repeatedly. This concept, by the way, is very consistent with the small sat notion, because just as you can build a small sat cheaply, you should be able to build a box cheaply that can be taken to GEO. Now, how would you get it up there? Well, DARPA has also developed a capability. Many of you are familiar with the hosted payload concept. So this is where a communication satellite goes out to geostationary orbit, but it had spare volume and it had mass margin on the launch vehicle. The DARPA-hosted payload, which is called PODS, is actually able to be dispensed. It's able to be detached off of the host vehicle and go out into space, where the robotic servicer will grab it and take it to a new satellite, take payloads out of it, and install them on new satellites. Not only does this allow us to provide defensive capabilities to legacy spacecraft, it also gives us a replenishment capability once we start building spacecraft with defensive payloads on them. But CubeSats have excited the academic community, they've excited entrepreneurs. Here's a CubeSat-like object that instead of falling out of space after a few months, now has all of the permanency and the persistence of a GEO spacecraft, but it didn't have to be integrated with a propulsion system and an attitude control system. It's just a box. And all of the complexity of operating in GEO is assumed by the robotic servicer. So we're at the stage now, we've been investing in these technologies actually for 12 years. And they're at a pretty high state of readiness. We're moving toward a flight program with a launch around 2020. We're not fully ready to go because what we're trying to do is develop partnerships with the other spacefaring agencies of the US government, so the Air Force, the NRO, and NASA, to combine and operate this satellite, to learn from it, to avoid technology surprise, DARPA's initial mission. We want to avoid a robotic Sputnik moment because we do have competitors. Learn from it, operate it, provide real services to real spacecraft, the commercial birds that are out there, as well as the military birds, and get lots of operating experience. The nice thing about GEO is all the birds are in one ring, so it's very easy to go from customer to customer. We're just starting these dialogues with the other agencies now, hopefully to pull together a national partnership in this idea of operating the first robotic servicer in geostationary orbit and providing all of these resiliency benefits that I've mentioned here today. So thank you again for your attention, and I do look forward to the questions.
Thank you. So we got a lot of really great questions from the audience already, and please keep filling out cards. We've got a lot of time to explore these issues. You can kind of categorize the questions that have come in from the audience in policy, technology, funding, and then my favorite I categorize as politics, and we'll kind of get to that. There's an undercurrent there.
Oh, no.
But one of the best questions came in and it said, it sounds like every one of you thinks that lunch is the hardest problem, and I think they meant launch. So it said, so what are we doing about it? So could particularly for the services and for DARPA, what do you see happening on rapid launch?
Do you want to talk about rapid launch?
You covered.
Sure. Am I on?
I think you're on. Looks like you got me too.
So I mentioned the two programs that DARPA is working on that provide more operational responsive launch and that sort of thing. The F-15 launch program, ALASA, and then the XS-1, the reusable accelerator vehicle spaceplane. We also believe strongly that the nation should figure out how to leverage the various commercial, the crazy billionaires that are out there investing, Jeff Bezos and Paul Allen and all the other guys that are investing in these launch programs. Not every one of them is going to succeed, but the ones that do kind of represent an architecture, I think that, I don't know that there's so much technologically we need to do beyond that, but we are highly supportive of these efforts that are going forward.
I would just add that it's certainly something that's got our attention, and it's something that we're managing very aggressively as we go forward. And it's frankly something that the department is trying to get its arms around, and probably keeps a lot of us up late at night. And that's if you will, the ability to transition from our current launch infrastructure and our current launch systems to what the next generation launch systems and capabilities look like. It's an exciting time. I certainly agree to see how this is going to play out. Whether or not it's, we're thrilled, for example, with the progress that SpaceX has made, certification of their 9V11 rocket, the Falcon. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. We believe that there's plenty of additional opportunities. ULA has certainly got the Vulcan on the drawing board. Any number of different new entrants, as we've released our RFP recently, seeking what the new engine market might look like, and ultimately what a transition to a complete launch system will look like. We're really looking forward to receiving the industry feedback and being able to understand and help define what those next generation architectures look like, those systems look like, and then how responsive that they will be. I mean, responsivity is an absolutely big issue. But we're trying to define that, but in partnership with industry, it's going to take us some time, and it's important that we get it right.
So Rob, just part of the reason I really got interested in the small sat discussion was the low cost nature of it. You do have some NRE that you have to buy down. Most of the items are already space qual, but the laminated tanks are really kind of fascinating, because the way they do the lamination, they withstand the burst tests as well as any tank produced. And then separately, because of the unique feed system, they're not using a turbo pump. So it saves a little bit of weight. The issue with, the launch, and I think a lot of the flexibility with LASA on some of these other programs is exciting, and I would say it's been exciting, because with the SEAS program, with the TRON program, with SWORDS, we've been talking about these programs for 4 or 5 years now, and we're still talking about launch as an issue. So at the end of the day, I think it's the things that are actually getting up in space and the solutions that are actually being applied and funded. So the issue for me, again, stepping back from that small sat project standpoint, is not the options, it's what's being funded. And right now, to my mind, the bane of the existence with the small sat project I was working is there's no funding available. It's been looked at, it's been projectized, it's been SMC and AFSpace have both looked at the components of this program. We haven't gotten the dollars to move it out. And again, I hate to keep mentioning, Kestrel has not gotten funded to space. It's now almost an old idea. And that's because of the launch costs.
Well,
So,
but fortunately, Kestrel does now have a launch opportunity thanks to STP, and the process has finally worked its way through. But you did mention SWORDS, and from the launch perspective. So the Army has, in cooperation with OSD, invested dollars to get after a joint capability technology demonstration, and that was Soldier Warfighter Operationally Responsive Deployer for Space. Big, long, but SWORDS. And the intent there was to try to take advantage of commercial, off-the-shelf capability. The cryogenic that medical supply produce very good cryo valves. The race car industry produces some pretty good technology and components. So the idea was, can you put that together and make a rocket very cheap in the $2 million price range? Some of the challenges there were we didn't get the non-traditional aerospace folks interested in doing some of the more expensive pieces, like the propellant tanks and those things. Right. But we were able to achieve, using mostly COTS components, we were able to build a thrust chamber and build an engine and put a nozzle on it and demonstrate for about $1 per pound force of thrust an engine. We tested around 55,000 pounds of thrust, and it cost us about $60,000 for the parts for the engine. So that's pretty amazing. The problem was getting it to that next step. We did not have the resourcing it's hard for people to understand how much it really costs for the NRE and everything to go build a new rocket, right? And so the Army just didn't have that, the OSD just didn't have that at the time. And so we're very interested in what commercial industry is doing, and with DARPA, with ALASA and Salvo and some of the others. So I think, again, we all recognize the fact that launch is a key enabler for so much of what we want to do.
So we turn it back over to Gordon, but this morning, Secretary Works said $5 billion is being set aside to work these issues. I think everybody heard him talk about that, and in fact, he said, I know that's not a lot of money. For all of you who work in small satellites, small launch, $5 billion, you mentioned $200 million for 10-sat. So Gordon, you were going to talk about a technical issue too, but I think after you answer that, for the group would be, we used to say, Mark, you and I once in a while would say, a vision without resources is a hallucination. So the issue then becomes where are the resources? The resources come from convincing the seniors that we've got something that's more than vaporware, which goes back to technology.
Well, this isn't, I'm actually going to make it more of a policy point here, which is unusual for me, but it's something we're thinking about. I think we can take a page from NASA's book here, on both on the launch side, but also the more general question of how can we get more resources into the problem. So starting in 2005, under Administrator Mike Griffin, NASA began the COTS program, Commercial Orbital Transportation System. It was a co-investment by government and industry to create new launch vehicles in the United States. That would have completely failed had NASA not realized that there needed to be a carrot. It's not just, okay, the government wants a launch vehicle, so here's some money, go out and create a launch vehicle. They needed to see a business at the end of the day. Now, close on the heels of the COTS program was the CRS program, the Commercial Resupply of Station. That was an anchor tenant for those launch vehicles. Now, SpaceX has taken tremendous advantage of that, and they're now launching satellites to GEO on their own, in addition to sending resupply to the station. Orbital Sciences has had a little bit more of a rocky road there. But what we have to recognize as we're trying to engage with commercial industry to solve some of our problems is we have to say, what is the benefit to them? How are they going to help their shareholders by participating with us? If we can answer that question positively, then I think there's a case to be made there. I will give the example now technically in my program. Those services that I described of being done with a robot of inspection and repositioning and repair, those have strong economic value. Imagine a satellite in GEO, the average communication satellite produces $50 million a year of revenue, and it's operating at 50% of capacity because one of its solar panels didn't come out. If I can go up there and push that solar panel out, I have restored $375 million of revenue to that company. So there's a business aspect that means that commercial industry might want to invest in this servicing capability because there's a real business there. We need to think about that for everything we want to do, whether it's reconstitution or imagery or whatever. As long as we can find, as they will identify a revenue stream, then I think there's hope. And in terms of the $5 billion, that's going to be spread to various people who are going to tackle parts of this resiliency problem one by one by one. If there's anything we can do to get commercial industry to contribute to that, we should. But they're not going to do it unless they see the benefit. Right?
Well, on a technical, one of the other questions, General, was directed at you, and it's regarding technology. And the question was tech insertion. So they implied in the question, I think they're correct, that a lot of seniors think that the technology isn't really there yet to be able to have military value from smaller satellites. I think more and more people are their eyes are being opened that it really is available now. So what's the technology insertion path to be able to bring this forward?
Yeah, I think there's a number of important aspects that we touched on briefly that I'd like to follow back up on, Rob. First, as you mentioned, Secretary Work indicated that there is a vision here There was certainly a commitment on behalf of the Department of Defense to follow through and fund some of these key programs, these key space initiatives, these technologies, to put us on a different path, to help us achieve a different end state than the path that we were on. And so with that, with that commitment, there's got to be follow through. And I think that's incumbent upon all of us as a national security space enterprise. You don't see opportunities like this come very often. And it's important to seize the moment and follow through with these initiatives, these programs, and make them successful. And so I believe the only way that we're going to be able to do that is to follow through on these commitments. It's not now, it's not talking about it. And while it's important to discuss concepts like this at these kinds of forums, the real work and the real follow through is going to be done here over the next few years to make sure that these strategies and analysis of alternatives and the requirements actually translate into meaningful programs that deliver real capability. And so I think that's first and foremost foundational of what we're trying to do. With regard to the need for technology insertion, I think that there's a number of important steps that we are taking, first with Congress's support and help for our mainstream programs, again mentioned earlier, OPIR with the Space-Based Infrared System program, as well as Advanced EHF program. Our Space Modernization Initiative funding lines allow us to, if you will, they represent the seed corn of what we're trying to do, and with regard to the future of what those two particular architectures represent and where we need to go to explore, to mature technology, to insert technology when it may be available, as well as to reduce risks early on in these programs and make sure that we get this next generation systems planned right. And that they're foundationally, technologically secure, that that they are going to be successful, and that we be able to move forward in a rapid development and production environment. I think that's absolutely key. With that as well, I would offer the continued work and support that we get, whether it's through DARPA or our Air Force Research Laboratory or other laboratory partners all across government, in that there is a rich technological base. I chair the DoD Space Experiments Review Board. And in that process, we see whole of government solutions coming forward, waiting to be vetted, waiting for rideshare opportunities, waiting for opportunities to demonstrate capability. And it's important that we be able to grab those key technologies, programs, and efforts and mature them and field them quickly.
I've got an ask for you.
Go ahead, Gordon.
No, I've got an ask for you at CERB.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so technology insertion is a push-pull, right? We've got a question in here that then asks, particularly Mark and Tom, are your customers, in your case, Tom, you're the combatant forces, who you referred to earlier, have they stated the gap? Do they see that as a requirement? Are they supporting what you're trying to do, or is it more of a push than a pull? And then the same thing on the ground architecture and for small satellites. Mark, NGA talks about the darkening of the skies. Do you see your workforce and your customer base pulling and wanting that information? So do you have that customer support?
Yeah, I mean, the combatant commands are very much pulling and wanting the capability. They see value added, they put it in priority lists, they talk about it. One of the challenges is, and it's unfortunate, that the combatant commands can want everything under the sun, but at the end of the day, they're not funding any of it. And so it's left on the services to determine that they're going to provide that capability or not. And so while the technology may be very mature, and there may be a lot of points in which we can inject that technology, a lot of the challenge is still, where does it rank in the overall priorities of the service? And how does it fit into the, okay, we've got reduced budgets, we've got X amount of money, we've got to do X plus Y worth of stuff. What do we not want to do to go do that? And so it's a challenge right now. And until the technology, until some of this capability is really demonstrated in the real world scenarios, it's going to be tough to do. But the combatant commands are very supportive. The joint capability technology demonstrations and many of the other investments that we are making as an Army are coming with endorsement letters from the combatant commands. And so it's important to have their support and backing in this. And then the leverage across the services and other We've worked very well with NGA and NRO and other three letters on here's some of the potential that you get. And so endorsement letters are great, but at the end of the day, the services have to put the dollars in there to go carry it forward.
That's right. Mark?
So I think the director was asked the question directly this morning, is the culture at NGA ready for this darkening in the skies? And he always talks about how he carried the IC's homework, he was proud to do it, to the #1 customer the last 4 years. He's kind of our #1 customer right now in NGA, and so he's asking these questions. And when you look back at a couple of historical events where we just about crowdsourced the reporting, I think Katrina was probably the first really decent one where we actually supported the aspect aircraft that did hyperspectral to look at all the flood zones to make sure there wasn't fuel loose. And Georgia in 2008 was kind of a crowdsourced model for reporting. Haiti certainly was in 2010. And the Arab Spring, as well as this recent effort with Nepal that he reported on, the Ebola, that was a customer demand for an unclassed product. But Robert also put a demand on NGA to kind of look at the sources and methods we're using. And a classic case that you've probably heard more than I have is, what did we get last night? Yeah. And it's kind of cloud covered last night, or today, not last night, but it's kind of cloud covered, so we didn't really get coverage. It's like no commercial, no social media, so that's a totally different demand signal. Again, I mentioned the Internet of Things. That has the promise or the premise that, the answer is available, somebody knows it, and that we can get access to it. To me, that's a form of resiliency in this regard because, the Abbottabad example is one of the best one about the guy tweeting, go away little bird, up doing his homework, and, he happens to hear the choppers coming in during the raid. Imagine if that would have been, blown by some guy tweeting. But the customer demand for information and then the responsibility to make sure that what you're getting has some pedigree. You know what the credibility of the information is. You don't want it to be the first time you've looked at the source. So I think there's a huge demand, if that's what you're talking about, for us looking at different sources, different methodology, and a way to get this information in without regard to, whether you had a space asset cover it, for instance.
So if you have a demand signal, that makes it a little bit easier to work the Hill, to get people aligned on the idea that it's a good expenditure. And we must have either a historian or a political scientist in the audience because they referred back to the presidential decision directive that directed commercial imagery be the first source for area coverage, for mapping. Remember that? And so the question
then they're done that.
Yeah, the question then becomes, will we see a stimulant for small satellites like we saw in the mid-90s that led to GEOI and Digital Globe?
Well, I think I was saying earlier, that's the bane to me of the existence, or getting to the tipping point, the seismic shift that says that you have a viable commercial source. Robert made the statement, I think this morning, that 90% of our foundation data now is produced by commercial. So we've taken the pressure off the other elements of the constellation. That's non-time demand, non-time sensitive. You're kind of getting it by the pound when you can, processing it by the pound when you need to. So you can put that on the shelf and work it later. I don't think that's what we're talking about here, and that's the difference to me, is you don't have a customer saying, God, I need this whenever you can get it and give me the answer in a couple of months. So until you get enough base on the commercial side with diverse phenomenology or spectra so that you have a reasonable assurance that if you need an answer, you can go after it. So I think that's the demand signal we would need to send kind of as a community, as part of resilience, that, it's almost like a defense in depth. You don't do that by thinning your resources and, populating them. You do it by investments in depth, in earnest for the capability that we think we need. And again, there may be a strategy out there to do that. I haven't seen it. There's an emerging strategy that looks good. I think the Air Force did a great study that reported out in the fall of 2014. It did a real good job categorizing what is a mini, what is a micro, what is a small sat, what is a medium sat. My 200 kilogram satellite is not your 2,000 kilogram, satellite. So we do have a little bit to do from the policy standpoint, and as a community, kind of sending out the signal of what it is we would be willing to fund on the commercial side, because up to this point, it hasn't been some of the things we're talking about.
So kind of a segue on cost sharing, sir, General Teague, these were several questions to you about international partners.
Yeah.
And so, as example, what role can and should the Allies play in working with the U.S. to assure space resilience? Do the Allies need to step up?
Well, I think the foundations for those partnerships have been put in place already through a number of important initiatives, particularly with regard to data sharing for space situational awareness. U.S. Strategic Command, the commander has led an effort in regards to space situational awareness data sharing with international partners that really forms the foundation of that. Beyond that, I think there's a number of important initiatives through programs that through shared investment and/or capabilities that are being hosted, U.S. capabilities or U.S.-led capabilities. For example, siting of the space fence or siting of other assets, whether it's a space telescope. I think Australia is going to be hosting that program. These are important efforts that help us collectively ensure the broader good of our international partnerships, and I think they're a foundation, and we'll only see them grow. Individually, none of us can do it alone, but collectively, we can certainly achieve a much more complete understanding of our operating environment. And in the end, it's all about transparency. You behave differently when you know that you're being watched. And so that's an important concept that as we look to expand our space situational awareness capabilities, it's about data sharing with our international partners.
Gord?
I didn't mention earlier, but a couple of the parts of my robot are being built by other nations, Germany and Canada. But beyond that, we're getting interest from multiple nations, multiple space agencies of other nations on standard setting. So not just, what size box should we build and what kind of USB port should we have, but how should we operate in order to maximize transparency, minimize, the risk for damage and that sort of thing in space servicing. I think it's going to go beyond servicing to standard setting. And if we start sharing each other's assets, for example, suppose we hang a U.S. payload on a satellite that's flagged in another nation, that not only increases transparency and cross-trust, but it complicates an adversary's problem because he has to decide now, I will not just attack U.S. satellites, but I will have to attack, commercial satellites too in order to achieve my objectives of denying, American space superiority. I was at another conference recently and one of the speakers said, it's not just that our satellites are tempting targets. If there was another nation that was going to go against the United States, they made that decision, they would have to take out our space assets. They're too good, they're too useful, they're too commanding. And so the more international collaboration and even sharing of objects in space, footprints in space and that sort of thing, the more complicated I think the adversary's problem is going to be.
Mm-hmm. There was a couple of questions about the ground architecture. Mark, several of you mentioned, I think all of you actually mentioned the ground. Mark, you'd talked about the amount of data available. One of the questions said it's going to be overwhelming, it's going to be massive. How will you be able to handle that amount of data at NGA?
Well, the key, I think, for the future is in the partnership discussion that the director led this morning that says we're not going to. You know, we did a study several years ago to look at, you know, with the fleet of FMVs and 26 orbits and building out over 50 orbits, what type of storage capacity would we need, you know, in consideration of the airborne and the NTM-PED. And I want to say that study, you know, it was a ridiculous number, 130 petabytes or something, you know, just unmanageable, unthinkable, not smart, you know, because you could never, in the access curve for those data sets, you know, once they're more than about 5 or 6 days old, you know, the timeliness goes down to the point where it's not even access. It's access 3% or something over the next year. So it just makes, no firm would do that. And the government would go broke trying to chase that. So I think, you know, we had a panel yesterday where Skybox was talking about servicing customers that want a number. You know, they have an algorithm that looks, whether it's petroleum tanks or counting cars, and we're working on similar algorithms within InnoVision that do depot counting and things like that, and you can imagine the uses for that. We're going to buy those numbers in the future. It makes no sense for us to host the data or to get those data sets. And once we get those algorithms kind of to the point where they're to our liking, or if a customer develops an algorithm that, you know, says, hey, I can track any ship, anywhere, anytime, and I can tell you who it is, where they're going, where they've been with the manifests. So you're hearing with the Pathfinder project, the concept of analytics as a service. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Now, I have no idea how that pricing model is going to work as I'm sitting here right now. Where, you know, we're going to stand up the Pathfinder 1 August, and the goal is go after our 4 key questions. But using analytics as a service, we're not going to host all those data sets. The concept of getting the data sets into a data lake and not buying a login and having an analyst start from the point where, okay, I log in, now what's in here? But harvesting, you know, doing analytics as a service, getting those data sets treated, exposed through a data lake, through the cloud. We're not going to rehost those data sets. We're going to run the algorithms in. We're going to grab the information we need. It can stay right where it's at. Commercial partners can do the same thing once we expose the interest items we have, the timelines we're looking at getting to, and more importantly, the criteria for goodness. You know, those algorithms for the counting cars right now, I think our scientists doing that, Dr. Bill Glass, is getting less than 3% error rates on those runs. Well, the spec is around 5. You know, we can tolerate up to 5. So at 3, he's done for the day. And that takes 2 minutes to run that algorithm, or less than that. You just do a centroid, apply it, and it's not really it can work on a picture. So as those capabilities, you know, emerge, I think that's the economic model. I don't know what the pricing is going to look like for that. Are you going to go to a menu and buy, you know, count the cars, not the oil, count the fish? I have no idea. That's what's got to be worked out as we go forward. But I think there's great, and I'm sorry I'm taking a long time, but the bottom line is we are not going to store all those data sets.
Right.
Yeah, we can't.
And there are technical approaches to evaluate the quality over time. So you don't have to, you know, you don't have to certify every one of those things.
Right.
So there's I promise there was a bucket called politics. Actually, this is good. It's nothing,
Politics?
you know, nothing too concerning here. Actually, first
I
of all,
like my job.
It was for the Army. Yeah, the question for the Army was, would the Army, because of Kepler, their satellite will be covering more than maybe where you've done an insertion, would the Army be willing to have that data or the pictures be taken for other users around the world and have that data enter into not only the Army's architecture, but into a national architecture, share the data?
Yeah, so our main focus of everything that we're doing right now is to make sure that anything and everything we do gets distributed into the architecture that exists. We don't want to reinvent the ground system architecture. We don't want to invent how the data gets moved. That's not what within Space and Missile Defense Command we're doing. We're looking at the technology on how to give that information. We want to put it into the existing Army networks, into the NROs and the other networks out there, so that all of that data goes anywhere it needs to go and it can be used by anybody that it needs to. The key is we want the tactical user to be able to be in an AOR and say, look, I've got a Kestrel Eye type satellite that's coming. I want to see what's on the other side of that hill. I'm going to task it. It's going to come into field of view, get the tasking, take the picture, get it down to that soldier. That's the concept. But that picture can also then go anywhere, store and forward, through the ground system architecture that it comes in on, any number of things. And so we're getting after, how we distribute it. And the other thing, talking about the data analytics and all, that's another thing that we're trying to do. It's how can we help use computer power and automation to help do some of that analytics for us, so that we don't have to have analysts all the time sitting down, going through reams and reams and gigabytes and terabytes of data to figure something out. How do we scope out what are the relevant things, what are the changes, what are the things that need to be focused on, and how we use that. And then the key is distribute that information. A lot of that may not ever get used by anybody, but those that need it will have it at their disposal. So great question, and it's absolutely what we need to do.
The second one is also for the Army, and again, a historian in the audience talking about, historically it seemed that NGA and NRO may not have been supportive of tactical satellites. Are they today? Would they support the Army today? And so, your perspective, and from, Mark, I don't want you to speak for Robert Cardillo, but could you imagine a Robert Cardillo sitting down with General Mann and telling Congress that, hey, we think this Kestrel Eye and what the Army's doing with small sats makes a lot of sense for both of you guys?
Yeah, I think there has been tremendous progress made over the last few years. Certainly the last couple of years that I've been doing what I'm doing now. Our collaboration with both NGA and NRO has been tremendous. The NRO has been a huge supporter and has been an absolute advocate in giving us rideshare opportunities for some of our CubeSats. They have, traditionally thought much larger. They've looked at the tactical utility, and it starts to play into the equation when you start talking about resiliency. You talk about not replacing, but augmenting capability, freeing up assets to do other things, and then providing information when they need to be doing something more specific. So all that starts to resonate with them. So we've had a very good relationship. I spend a lot of time up at the NRO. We've been working and collaborating a lot more to the tune of they've actually invested in the efforts that we're doing. They funded the ground station, the Gator tracking system to support Kestrel Eye in low Earth orbit, since we needed a tracking capability. NRO helped invest and fund that. So they're a great partner, and NGA has been as well.
Good. Mark?
Yeah, and I was going to say the Gator antenna is on display here. They've got the portable version and the mounted version. It
began with a DARPA seedling.
Yes.
Yes, it's
good.
But, how many scars do we have from talking not only the direct downlink discussion over the last, since 1986, when we first found out that the direct downlink wasn't going into the TR-1, it was actually 85. There's been bad blood over where these data sets are going. So with the Gator, most of the small set architecture that I've been looking at is going to leverage a Gator-like antenna to handle that, the pointy edge of the sword, to get it where it needs to be when it's taken, because most of the time that's the consumer you're supporting anyway. I'm certainly not talking for the director, but the work that we've been doing on the cloud the last 4 years, that's exposed in GitHub. They talked about Hootenanny was exposed on June 18th, which is our conflation capability. GeoWave's been exposed in GitHub. GeoWave is our cloud offering that Chris Benight has been working for a long time. We're experimenting with GPUs in C2S. and getting 10x orders just with the first cut at the pixel processing. It's not about just pixels, it's about information, but I'm hard pressed to understand why it would take a bucket of money today to do the ground processing for these data sets. Now, that's not to say it's not going to cost some money, because we don't have a cloud architecture working everywhere, but with the DGS WAN connectivity, you know, we're getting on the MTI side 1 to 3 second performance for tracks from the AOR today. So again, that's a small packet and a small data set, but with cloud coming on iSight, with the investments on iSight that we're going to make in the next couple of years, it's not even a processing problem anymore. I don't, you would be hard pressed to explain to somebody why you couldn't get them an image, you know, in the time frame that they need. It used to be if you could get that image to somebody in 4 to 5 hours, you're a hero of the Soviet Union. But, you know, if you can't get that thing out at warp speed, you know, to quote our old program favorite, you know, if you're not talking 5 to 7 minutes within TOT, you're not going to be relevant. And I think that's easily doable. Maybe I'm crazy, but.
Speaking of being relevant, then the walk-off question from the audience for all of you, we have about enough time for about a minute each, is what keeps you awake at night and what can industry do to help?
Okay. I want to implement a space servicing capability, and I want it to grow to a space logistics infrastructure and that sort of thing. What keeps me awake is policy. People are nervous about satellites getting close to other satellites. You know, there are the questions about the Outer Space Treaty and what does it really require, that sort of thing. Everybody who is involved in this from an economic standpoint, the insurers, the manufacturers, the operators, they want to see this. What keeps me awake is policy, honestly. Fortunately, I have a boss who has worked policy issues at the FAA and at NASA, so I'm getting a lot of help there. I'm not a policy guy myself.
Help is good. Mark?
Nothing keeps me up at night. I've worked for NGA for 15 years. I mean, how many? I was the space-based radar program manager. Come on.
Yeah.
The two things that we could really use some help on, one is the generation of hypothesis-driven courses of action for stuff. So like Russia-Georgia example, or Russia-Ukraine kind of example, where you're just kind of looking at what's the art of the possible, what could happen. And the second is dynamic content. With Chrome and HTML5 coming in, our enterprise isn't optimized for new browsers. And as these new browsers come in with a new viewing capability, we're finding out that, you know, our data stores are crap. You know, you can't do search very well, semantics. We have a lot of good work going on. Justin Pohl's X organization is just doing a great job. Our ASC on the content side is doing a great job. But that historical data, as you look back, and I'm talking 40 years worth of data, back when you were in the Navy Yard and Robert, that data those data sets are just terrible, so they need to be fixed. And we need some help with dynamic content and the visualization aspect.
Okay, good. Tom?
So what keeps me up is not delivering capability that our warfighter needs to save lives. One of the things with our communication satellite that keeps coming back to me is the lone survivor. Everybody's probably seen that movie. To me, it's completely unacceptable in this day and age that we had soldiers cut off from the ability to communicate and phone home and get the heck out of there. That is unacceptable to me, and I do what I do to make sure that we can deliver that capability. And obviously, you know, I'm an Army guy, right? So I can't do it by myself. I need industry to help us. And the way we do that is we take the technology that we have the ability to do and we package it, and we go out and we do those utility demonstrations, and we get the decision makers to understand that this saves lives. What we're doing will make a difference, and will keep soldiers coming home from conflict that right now we're losing too many because of that.
Okay, good. Thank you. General?
Well, I appreciate the question, and certainly appreciate the opportunity again to be here, Rob, and thank you for hosting this panel. It's awesome. I mentioned earlier, and it would repeat again, certainly I am concerned about the transition that our EELV, our launch enterprise, is making right now. It's critical that we get this right. I'm getting a lot of help. on that, which is great. There's no shortage of opinions on that. Industry is doing its part, and so I thank you for the continued support and attentiveness and responsiveness on behalf of industry to be able to come and bring forward solutions, and as we work to again mitigate the effects of this transition and we move forward to that next generation launch system. And I would also add, if I could, it's important that we've been given a mandate, if you will, to be able to move forward with determination, with speed, and to be able to get our future systems right, to address the growing threat. And it's important that collectively, as a national security space enterprise, that we do so deliberately and that we address these issues as quickly as we can, and that we not stretch this out as we have in the past and as we sometimes have a tendency to into programs that take 5-10 years. We don't have time for that. We need to be able to move forward, address and field capability quickly, consistent with Tom's point about making sure that we are protecting our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen to protect them and keep them out of harm's way and let them do their jobs and preserving the peace. So again, thank you, Rob.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I also want to thank the audience. These were great questions. I think everybody would agree, very insightful. So thanks for your time today.